The Austrian business cycle theory is one of my favorite topics. And the title page I'm using, though, is capital-based macroeconomics. And I've learned that sometimes that title gets the job done in a way that associating the theory with a particular country, even if such a lovely country as Austria, doesn't quite work. And as you'll see in later lectures I give, we can name each of the major schools of thought out of a particular focus. Capital theory, capital and interest, being the focus of the Austrian school, contrasted with the Keynesian economics, which is labor-based economics. And if you don't know already, you'll see why in a subsequent lecture. And of course, monetarism is money-based economics. And so it gives a trilogy there that already gives hints of the differences between the schools. I like to use the subtitle down here, sustainable and unsustainable growth, although I've been warned off of using that word, sustainable, because it's come to mean something very different in the green community. That anything that's sustainable means environment friendly and so on. Sustainable and unsustainable growth, which is the macroeconomics of boom and bust. I want to start out by just giving you a very brief overview so you see what you're in for. And what you'll see is that the approach tonight is very much of an analytical approach. I'm going to throw some graphs at you. I think you'll be able to follow them. I've designed that with that intent in mind, that they're understandable. So I'm going to have an analytical approach, and in a subsequent lecture, I'll have a more historical approach where I focus on the Great Depression and all of its particulars. But the theory of the business cycle in the Austrian school is actually a theory of how a boom turns into a bust. It's a theory of the upper turning point. It doesn't have a whole lot to say, or at least a whole lot unique to say, about all of the things that can go wrong once the economy has entered the downturn. And we'll take a historical perspective on that, as you'll see later. So I start out with several elements of capital-based macro, and most of them probably look familiar to you. The production possibilities frontier, I think, is something that Dr. Murphy talked about earlier today. Loanable funds market, that is just the market that determines the interest rate, the borrowing and lending activities that go on and give us a market rate of interest. It's a theory that is very applicable. It's good for applications of one sort or another, and it's not at odds at all with the time preference theory of interest, which you've heard about from Herbener. The structure of production is represented by a triangle, the Hayekian triangle, and I've asked around and convinced myself that no one earlier today drew or talked about a Hayekian triangle, which tells me they're just falling down on the job. That's all there is to it. So we'll have to make amends and say a little bit more about that. Stage-specific labor markets, it just won't do, as Keynes thought it would, to talk about the labor market and the wage rate. When capital is involved, there's different kinds of capital, and the labor that goes with each kind has a different market, and the wage rate may vary from one to another. We need to pick that up in our analysis. And then in applications, I have two, and I want you to pay attention to the relationship between them, because I'll spend probably most of the hour talking about sustainable growth, which is supported by saving, and follow that then by unsustainable growth, which is triggered by credit expansion. It's policy-induced growth that doesn't last precisely because there wasn't any savings to see the projects through. And one theme that I'll emphasize during the lecture is a certain methodological point made by Friedrich Hayek. And that is that if we want to figure out what goes wrong in the economy such that we have a bust, we better first understand how things could have ever gone right. It's a methodological maxim that commands assent just from stating it. Before you can figure out what's gone wrong, you better figure out how things could ever have gone right. And one of the reasons that the Austrian theory is just a bit more complex than the alternative theories is precisely because they heed that maxim. And we have to set the stage by showing how things could work out fine if only allowed to work out. And then we're in a position of indicating what could go wrong. The what could go wrong part, which is really the theory of boom and bust, turns out to be a corollary. If you want things to go right, you have to let markets work. If you don't let markets work, if you intervene in one form or another, and especially intervene in order to manipulate the interest rate, I'm sorry, that's not going to work out right. That's going to go wrong. And the particular way it goes wrong is an artificial boom followed by a bust. You have heard a lecture on Ludwig von Mises. I heard it too, from Ralph Raico, and I won't say too much more about him because you know all about him. Friedrich Hayek developed the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Mises articulated it early in 1913 in his theory of money and credit, just a few pages where he sketched out the outline. And Hayek developed it at length during the late 20s and into the 30s. Mises had a more elaborate statement of it in his Human Action, German edition, in 1940, and the latest in 1966. And I'll dedicate a whole slide here to Hayek's methodological point. Before we could even ask how things might go wrong, we must first explain how they could ever go right. And that's a maximum that is observed in the breach. You know what that means. By macroeconomists. I was corresponding on email with David Laidler, Canadian monetarist, I think he calls himself, with emphasis on Canadian. I'm not quite sure what all that entails, but I suggested that Keynes had not heeded the Hayekian maxim. He had not explained how in the world a market could ever work, and therefore wasn't in any position to explain what could go wrong. And Laidler wrote back and he says, well, he's in good company. Nobody else explains how it could work either. So the Austrians are alone on this one, I think. Let's start out with the production possibilities frontier and use what I consider a very standard rendition of it, where we plot consumption on the vertical axis, investment goods on the horizontal axis. It certainly is consistent with a major Austrian theme of the scarcity of resources and the need to make choices and trade-offs. And if you want more investment goods, which will give you higher levels of consumption in the future, well, fine, but you'll have to make do with fewer consumption goods in the present. You'll be located on a different position on that production possibilities frontier. It's a little graphical representation that you'll find in virtually every economic textbook, principles level textbook, but it's never used in a macro context. It's always used just in a micro context to emphasize the fact of scarcity and the need to make trade-offs and opportunity costs. And, it's in the introductory chapter. It never comes back. It is used sometimes to show variation in growth across countries. If post-war Japan made great sacrifices of current consumption in order to produce investment goods and goods for export, well, it grew rapidly. And the U.S. Made sacrifices in the other direction, okay, with lots of consumption goods and not nearly so much investment goods. And so it grew more slowly, and that's a standard use of the curve. And I'm just going to use it here for macroeconomic purposes, and you'll see how it fits. And so if markets actually are working, if wages find their own level, interest rates find its own level, and prices, then we'll end up somewhere on the frontier, and anywhere on the frontier is a fully employed economy. And if you're at the right point on the frontier, it's the point that corresponds to people's time preferences, something that I suspect Bob Murphy did talk about. People can make choices about how to spend their money, how much of it to use for current consumption, how much to save. Okay, and those kinds of choices are what determines where on that frontier the economy will be. Investment in this construction, unlike Keynesian constructions, is gross investment. It's all the investment, including the investment you need just to replace worn-out capital, obsolete capital, and so on. So that amount of investment, and we're talking about investment goods, plant and equipment, tools and machinery of all sorts, capital goods, that will produce consumer goods in the future. Okay, and so that distance is gross investment. Now we recognize that a good part of gross investment is replacement capital. It's called depreciation. A good bit, but not all of it. Okay, and so if we identify just arbitrarily some amount of the capital that we're creating each period as replacement capital, then that leaves the rest as net investment. That's capital that gives us, well, bigger capital stock, a more capital-intensive structure of production to produce output in the future. And so the difference then, of course, is the net investment. There's the net investment. All right? Now, with net investment, the economy grows. You can see pretty easily that if all the investment were nothing but replacement capital, okay, so that PPF would describe the economy this year and next year and the next year and so on. But if some part of it is net investment, then the economy will grow. And so we'll say, watch the economy grow. Okay? Now listen to the economy grow. Okay? Go through 4 periods here where the economy is growing, which means each year you can produce more of both investment goods and consumption goods and have greater output in both directions. Now, what's important to the Austrians, and this might seem almost unbelievable, but it's true, okay, is that only the Austrians allow for movement along the production possibilities frontier. As we'll see in a later lecture, Keynes simply denied it. In fact, we'll see it to some extent in this lecture. Keynes always had investment and consumption moving in the same direction, never in the opposite directions. And the monetarists put it all into eclipse by writing MV equal PQ and encasing in Q, that's total output, the whole of the Austrian theory. There's something going on inside of Q, so they put it in eclipse. But it says we can have changes in saving preferences. Herbener probably said a fall in time preferences. People decide to save more for the future. I feel too defensive in explaining why people might make those choices, but it's really necessary to say something about it because Keynes denied it. Keynes said people don't just decide to save more or decide to save less. People save about, just in relation to their current income. That's the only thing that matters, their current income. But of course, people can make these choices. They can save up for retirement, thinking Social Security is not going to be there for them. Right about that. Or they could save up to travel during retirement. People live longer these days, or to send their kids to a better college. Okay? There's all sorts of reasons to save. So here, watch the economy move along the PPF, and we're going to go in the direction of investment. That's because people, for reasons of their own, they don't have to tell us, have decided they want to save more. So watch the economy move along the PPF. There it goes, okay? Now, Keynes denied that that was a possibility. In fact, as we'll see, it's the basis of his paradox of thrift. If people do save more, try to save more, it doesn't move you along the PPF. It throws you off the PPF into the interior, into a depression. You'll be sorry you tried to save. Saving doesn't drive the economy. Spending does. That's Keynes. Now watch the economy grow. Well, what do you predict? It'll grow faster. You just hear, you sound it. It sounds faster. Okay, it's growing more. Look at it. Okay, so save a little now, and you get more growth. We can even compare it. See, increased thriftiness makes a difference. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. Compare it to the PPF I just showed you a while ago, and you can see that the difference is that the initial increase in saving makes the pattern of consumption, it changes the pattern of consumption and investment. without the initial increase. You got growth, but it was moderate or slow growth, as shown by an arrow there. But on the other side, you got first a decrease in consumption, movement along the frontier, followed by pretty substantial growth. And after just 4 periods, it turns out you're able to consume more than you otherwise would have. Okay, I don't want to sound like your parents telling you to save more. You'll be glad you did. In fact, I'll make the point here that the Austrians are not cheerleaders for economic growth. And that's a rarity. Most economists, or the supply-siders, or policymakers in Washington, or even Friedman, he says one of the things that we all agree on is we want rapid growth. No, that's not it. We want a growth that's consistent with your time preferences. All right, and all this says is that if you're willing to forego consumption now, the economy will grow faster. But you make the choice. It's your income. Not cheerleaders for growth. Now, I want to look at the loanable funds market because that's what's going to affect the interest rate to cause business people to invest more. And so I've got a supply and demand axis here, the rate of interest on the vertical axis, and saving, and then separately investment, which actually translate into this axis. This is borrowing and lending. So this is borrowing for the purpose of making investments, the whole business community borrowing to make investments, and income earners as savers saving money to be borrowed. Okay, that's what's going on here. It's really simple analysis. Saving is the supply of loanable funds. There it is. Okay, and the demand reflects the business community's willingness to borrow and undertake investment projects. So the lower the interest rate, the more they're willing to borrow and undertake investment projects. This market, by the way, is just an application of supply and demand. It's Alfred Marshall. And we're going to apply it in a macro sense, which really allows this market to stand for all of the ways that the business community takes command of resources that are not consumed in the current period. So it would include, say, retained earnings, because the firm foregoes interest in order to retain the earnings and increase the capital goods that the economy has command over. It's interesting here that I can find places in boehm-bawerk, of course, the Austrian, and Keynes, who says that this market really is the market for investable resources. It's better thought of, at least in a macro sense, as the market for investable resources, which the business community takes command of by dealing through financial markets and borrowing funds or retaining earnings or something of that sort. Okay, so that investable resources, the horizontal component there, is the same horizontal component in the production possibilities frontier. It's the amount of investment that's undertaken each period. And here, just a little history of thought. You associate loanable funds theory most closely with the British economist Sir Dennis Robertson. And in fact, it's a theory that you do not find, I'll make one exception to this, you do not find in Keynes's general theory. He threw it out. And in fact, when Roy Harrod read the general theory in manuscript form, he told Keynes, he says, Maynard, it looks like you've thrown out the loanable funds theory. And Maynard said, okay, you understand it, you got it, that's it, it's out. Of course, he had a liquidity preference theory of interest instead. And Harrod told him, well, if that's what you intend to do, you better make that clear to your readers because nobody will believe you. Okay. And so Keynes put this graph in the book. In fact, the general theory has one and only one graph, and that's it, supply and demand for loanable funds. And he put it in there to emphasize that that's what he's throwing out. Okay. It's on page 180, I think. A lot of the theorizing, whether they use the graph or not, is loanable funds theory about what influences the rate of interest, increase in saving or decrease in saving and so on. It's implicit in a lot of Mises, implicit in Hayek, but they typically don't draw the graph because they don't do too many graphical analytics. It has a real easy interpretation. If people become more future-oriented, they increase their saving, causing the interest rate to fall, thereby encouraging business community to undertake more investment projects, which will yield up consumption goods in the future when these people have saved up money and are ready to spend it on something. So it says, watch the saving curve shift rightward. There it goes. There it is. So people became more future-oriented. It shifts rightward, lowers their interest rate, encourages the investment community to undertake investments. With a given technology and a given level of division of labor, I'll have to add that, savings is prerequisite to genuine sustainable economic growth. Okay, in fact, that's the only thing, apart from the other, from division of labor and technical progress, that's the only way you can get sustainable growth is to not consume everything now and save back some resources to build a capital stock for the future. I might mention, because some of you have read contemporary Austrians who downplay the significance of the loanable funds market. Murray Rothbard does, for instance, in Man, Economy, and State. But it's clear in Rothbard's critique that he's talking about a narrowly defined bank rate of interest because of the banker's loan market, and says, well, that's just a minor part of the intertemporal market, which is true. And the way we're using it, it's really the intertemporal market itself. In other words, it measures investable resources for production of consumer goods in the future. Okay. Now let's do a stock taking and show you what I've got so far is loanable funds market and a PPF that share a horizontal axis. All right. And so we should be able to tell our story with those two things together. Just as a reminder of what the two curves show, and as before, we're going to let savers decide to save more. Lower time preference, they want to save up more for the future. And it says, watch the saving-induced decrease in interest rate and the corresponding movement along the PPF. So what I want you to do is, I want you to turn your head sideways so you can watch the top graph with one eye and the bottom graph with the other eye. And you can see what happens. I'll play it twice in case you blink. Okay. So you can predict what will happen. The savings shift rightward, the interest rate falls, people undertake more investment. That reduction in consumption is the same thing as an increase in saving. That's what an increase in saving means, is you cut back on your consumption. So people are cutting back on their consumption, freeing up resources for investment purposes, giving the business community a reason to undertake those investments, in other words, low interest rates, giving them another reason as well. If they're saving up, it means they're accumulating purchasing power. And if there are any entrepreneurs out there at all, they know that there are profits to be made by gearing up, tooling up to produce things that people want to buy with those saved up funds. Okay. And that's what that tells you there. Now, it's important to see here that even this possibility is denied by Keynesian theory. Because Keynes says, the story he tells, and I've got it here, but I'll just tell it to you. He says, oh, well, if people cut back on consumption, that means that things are piling up at retail or piling up on the shelves. And if stores can't unload the stuff they've already produced, why would anyone want to produce more? And so investors will cut back rather than increase their investment. And if investors cut back, you have less investment when you've already got less consumption. The economy goes into the dumper. It goes into the interior region of the PPF. You're in a depression. Okay. And that's what this tells you here. You don't need to read this. So the arrows just show, yes, sure enough, when investment goes up, it's because consumption has gone down. But that's just a way of saying you move along the PPF. And by the way, if it turns out that it's just not possible to move along the PPF, then we've named the curve wrong because that second P stands for possibilities. Production possibilities frontier. If you can't do it, then the curve just becomes meaningless. Okay. Now, according to Keynes, I gave you the spiraling down. If you've taken sophomore macro, you get the spiraling down stuff and it goes down into the basement and so on. And Keynes even had a name for it, the paradox of thrift. So he didn't want people to save more, and actually didn't spend too much time in the general theory talking about it, because he says, fortunately, people don't save more. People don't change their saving preference. And boy, are we glad, because if they did, you're in the dumper. In other words, there was no possibility of the market working right. Okay. Now, if you take a closer look at Keynes, what you see is that he saw just one aspect of an increase in saving. Sure, it means a decrease in consumption by definition. And sure, that means that retail inventory would pile up in the store until somebody lowers price or something. Okay, sure, it means that. But there's another effect. There's another effect, and one that's just as important as the first one, and that is that the interest rate's lower. And if the interest rate's lower, then all sorts of things, research and development are encouraged, extraction industries that are aimed at consumption in the remote future are encouraged because the carrying costs on those things are very significant, and a lower rate of interest will tip the scales for a lot of investors to undertake just those kinds of investments. Far-sighted investors realize that people are building up their purchasing power, and profits are to be made by entrepreneurs who have the stuff ready for them when they're ready to spend that increased purchasing power. So we see two effects. And the interest rate effect comes about in the early stages of production and not the late stages. The late stages, that's retail, yeah, that goes down. Of course it does. But in the early stages, it goes up, okay, because the interest rate effect dominates what's called the derived demand effect. I'll show you more than that. Now, to keep track of this, that's where we need this Hayekian triangle. And so I'll explain how that works. Let's look at a Hayekian triangle. This is out of Hayek, Prices in Production, 1931. The Austrians don't talk about investment goods as just investment. That's Keynes, okay, They talk about investment as a structure. There's early stage investment, late stage investment, middle stage investment, okay. Depends on how much time is committed to the investment projects before you actually get the consumer goods. The stages of production are temporally defined. You could have extraction industries. That would be very early stage. You have manufacturing industries. That's in the middle stage. Retailing industries. That's the late stage. And so let's line up the stages and show in the form of a Hayekian triangle and show you how it works. At the end of the production process, consumption goods are yielded up. So that vertical leg is the consumption goods. Arrayed along the horizontal axis are the stages of production that start out small because you're just starting the project. You know, you're extracting the first hunk of iron ore for this project and so on. And it by itself is not worth much, but as it moves closer to consumption, where the retailer has something to sell, then it becomes worth more. So you get a structure of production that looks like that, called the Hayekian triangle. Here I want to avoid a lot of the thorny issues of capital theory. There's lots of thorny issues of capital theory. Don't even try to read all that literature. It'll give you a headache every time. But when we say early stages or late stages, we're just talking about different kinds of investment. An early stage, for instance, I'll draw you a picture of it, is product development. Okay, look at that guy. He's not going to have anything to sell for a good time, for a long time. But at low interest rates, he can afford to carry the costs of the research and development to have that eventually have consumption goods online. At the late stages, retail management. He's got it knocked, okay? His shelves all full. All he needs is customers. Maybe that is one there at the left, I don't know. But those are the kinds of things you want to think about when you think of early stage and late stage. Don't think about the nitty-gritty measurement of those particular activities. It's strictly qualitative here. Okay. Now, the 5 stages is just for pedagogical reasons. I could have made it 55, or I could have made it 3. But 5 turns out to work pretty well, just to get the pedagogy across. There are 5 stages, and look, all these stages exist at the same time. If we took field trips in this course, we could go out and visit some iron ore mining, and then visit some manufacturing, visit some retailing. It's all going on at once. In fact, that's the reason why Frank Knight says there's no time involved at all. It's simultaneous, doing everything at the same time. Okay, but of course, if you follow a piece of iron ore through the process, it takes quite a long time before it shows up at a car dealership, for instance, and ready to sell to a consumer. And so here we go. The 5 stages can be thought of as all existing at the same time, or a process through time. And we say watch the resources or goods in progress move through the stages, left to right. Start out with product development or whatever. There it is, okay. Now, you think you may not have seen anything like that quite before, but I think you have. So the word there is that I don't want you ever to see one of those commercials again without thinking of the Hayekian triangle. Just get it down in your mind. All right. So this is the Hayekian triangle. Now look, that consumption leg, the vertical leg, is the same thing as that consumption magnitude on the PPF. Okay? And so when the economy grows, that triangle grows with it. Let's see if we can't figure that out. Watch them expand together. Okay, they're expanding at that slower rate because we haven't had any savings. Okay, you can see the triangle's getting bigger, and the PPF is expanding outward. The triangle changed in size; it didn't change in shape because there hadn't been any increased saving. More importantly, though, when savers choose to save more, they send two conflicting signals to the market. We've already talked about them, but I want to get the emphasis here. The decreased consumption dampens the demand for retail inventories. And then if you go back a stage, say to the trucks that are transporting the goods to retail stores, well, that gets dampened too. But it doesn't get dampened all the way back to product development. Because when you get back far enough, and you're far enough removed from future consumption, the interest rate effect kicks in, and you get cheap credit that you can borrow funds, undertake investment projects, and take advantage of spending power that people are going to have in the future. So the first effect is called a derived demand effect. That's right out of Marshall. Okay, and the second effect is the interest rate effect, or sometimes it's called the time discount effect. Well, it's just the interest rate effect. Low interest rate stimulates production in early stages. Okay, and these two seemingly conflicting signals are only directly in conflict if you have two aggregate conception of investment. If you just have the Keynesian I for investment, as in C plus I plus G. Remember that from your sophomore year. Because which is going to prevail? Is it going to be the derived demand effect, or is it going to be the interest rate effect? Well, in the Austrian view, both prevail. In fact, that's what changes the shape of the triangle. Okay, so you get reduced altitude of the triangle, but an expanded base. Okay, you get more long-term projects. And let's see if we can do that. That's what that tells you right there. Oh, there's something at the bottom of that. It was precisely in this context where where Hayek said that Mr. Keynes aggregates, in other words, lump everything together, call it investment, conceal the most fundamental mechanisms of change. Because the fundamental mechanisms of change are the mechanisms that skew that triangle and keep it from producing too much output in the near future and a lot more in the distant future when people are ready to spend their saved up purchasing power. Okay. And here I do emphasize it. I just define those effects once more. It says, watch the structure of production respond to an increase in saving. Now, what do you think? Can you see already? Can you imagine what that triangle is going to do when I hit the trigger? When I tell you that people are going to save more, how does that triangle change shape? Watch it. The resources flow out of the late stages into the early stages. All right? And that allows the economy to gear up. No, I don't know if you can see that flow very well. You can see it better on my screen up here. Let me do it once more and you can see it. Okay, you can see the old triangle in silhouette right behind it, just for comparison. But the resources flow out into the earliest stages of production. Okay. And once again, that lines up with our PPF. Okay. Because now I'm going to pull the trigger again. Let's see if we haven't got a... Say, watch the economy respond to an increase in saving now. In other words, we move along the PPF in the direction of more investment, and a disproportionate amount of that investment is in the early stages of production. And in fact, in the late stages, there's a slacking off. Okay? So I'll pull the trigger, and you can watch both effects take place. Okay? Now you have a triangle that's more capital intensive. It has earlier stages than before. There are 6 stages instead of 5. It's tooling out for the distant future, which is exactly what you want if you're saving, okay? Because you're saving up to be able to consume more in the future. In my book, I like to write not just S for saving, but S-U-F-S. I don't overdo it. Saving up for something, okay? People don't just save. It's not fun, okay? They save up for something. It's something that makes them want to save, all right? And if the market is working right, it'll be there for them because there's been a low interest rate to encourage investors to okay, so there you got it. That's all that says is what I've told you. Okay, now we'll watch once again the economy grow more rapidly because I have another point to make. Well, you can see this a little more clearly on the screen, but you can see where consumption was on that triangle to start with, and then you can see that it first fell as people saved more, and then it rose as the economy grew faster. Okay, that's the way it works. And we can even plot that here in a way that I think is appealing. I'm putting consumption on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis, and showing what this path of consumption looks like. The economy is growing, and then you save, so consumption dips, but then it grows faster, okay? And eventually gets above where it would have been had it grown at that same slow rate. Let me trace that curve, project the curve where it would have gone had you not saved, you see. And what we can see is that essentially what's going on is that people are willing to trade a certain amount of consumption, in fact, all that consumption represented by the difference between those two curves, in the immediate future, for even more consumption in the more distant future. Again, we're not cheerleaders for economic growth. If that's what you want, then save, okay? If you don't want to save, well, fine, but then don't expect to have that increased growth. Okay, just a real quick sequence here. In order to track what's going on with the labor markets, you can't just have the labor market. You have to have stage-specific labor markets. And now instead of showing the picture of the people developing products and the picture of the retailer, I show them in terms of supply and demand for labor with early stage and late stage rendered separately. All right? And what we're getting here, what we do out of this, or do with this is show that when there's an increase in saving, then there are fewer jobs in the retail trade, but there are more jobs in product development trade. Okay, and so people are encouraged to go out of one and into the other. And how so? Well, by changes in the demand for labor, but they're opposing changes. They're not simple increase or simple decrease. So in the late stages, the drive-demand effect dominates, but in the early stages, interest rate effect dominates. Okay, so watch the economy respond to an increase in saving. You know what's going to happen to the triangle, and you tell me what you think is going to happen to the supply and demand for labor in the two stages. Well, you're going to get a decrease in demand in the late stages and an increase in demand in the early stages. There it goes, and you see which way the demand curve shifted. And in fact, there's something in Hayek where he draws a very crude picture of these labor markets, and he refers to it as a wage rate gradient. In other words, while there is increased saving going on, wages will be relatively high in the early stages and relatively low in the late stages. And if you connect the two equilibrium points, you see a gradient, that upward slope, okay, which means labor is being drawn out of the late stages into the early stages, and that gradient persists until the movement is complete, okay, until the capital restructuring is complete. That was Hayek's point. All right. So there are four elements, and we can see all four of them. We just watch them light up and show the interconnections, like so. Okay. And now for the first time, we can do it all at once. Now, you have to have several eyes to watch this, you know. But you pull the trigger now, you see the increased savings, you see the movement along the frontier, the change in the shape of the triangle, and the relative changes in labor markets. I'll do it a couple of times. Now, what you've seen there is the market at work for you and for me. In other words, that's how it can go right. Before you can understand how it can go wrong, you have to first see how it can go right. If you leave markets alone, let interest rates seek their own level as determined by supply and demand for loanable funds. Stay away from the wage rate, let it do what it will. Same for prices. Then that's how markets will work. Okay, I'll do it once more. Okay. Now, I've taken up a lot of time to show you all this, but it has a big payoff, because now what I can show is it's really just a corollary of what goes wrong if you don't let markets work. What goes wrong if the central bank gets in and manipulates interest rates and causes the interest rate to be lower than what's consistent with people's saving preferences. And that's just a restatement about going right and going wrong. I'm going to skip over another passage where Hayek is just reaffirming the business cycle as late as 1978. And go to credit expansion. And look, for all the world, it's the same graph, isn't it? Supply and demand for loanable funds. But we have to recognize that loanable funds, as distinct from saving, can come from the central bank. You can provide loanable funds by saving. The central bank can provide loanable funds by providing loanable funds. No saving, no abstention from consumption. Just flood markets with newly created money and drive interest rates down. What's wrong with that? Okay. So we can have a rightward shift in the supply of loanable funds without there being any increase in saving. It's done by the central bank. And it says watch the opposing movements, because, mind you, the saving schedule is going to stay put. Your choices about how much to save hasn't changed. What's happened is that the Fed has padded the supply of credit with more credit of its own making. So watch closely here. Now you get that same rightward shift, but you get a double disequilibrium, because you don't want to save any more than you did. In fact, now you save less because the interest rate's less. You're not getting as much for it. So the low interest rate will cause you to save less, while the low interest rate will cause investors to invest more. We can see this very graphically, literally. This padding or pumping new money through credit markets drives a wedge between saving and investment. So you see, investors are moving down that demand curve. They want more funds now with which to invest in, get them cheaper. Okay, but savers, they're moving down their supply curve. If they can't get any more than that for their saving, well, they'll just consume now. And what would otherwise just be a credit crunch, a shortage, is literally papered over by the central bank, which creates the difference, creates the money to fill the gap between saving and investment. Okay, if you have any economic intuition at all, you know that's not going to work out very well. Okay. And here just a reminder that Hayek's monetary theory hinges on these kind of dynamics and not on some overall increase in the price level as the money supply grows. He doesn't deny the kernel of truth in the quantity of theory, more money, higher prices. Yeah, okay. But they also affect relative prices because the new money comes in through credit markets and has an initial impact on interest rates. Okay. Now, all we have to do is trace upstairs here to see what goes on with the production possibilities frontier. What we see is that investors, they get a signal to move along the frontier in the direction of more investment. But consumers, by not being paid anything for their saving, they get a signal to move in the direction of more consumption. So what turns out to be a wedge in that lower diagram is a tug of war between consumers and investors. They're spending their money in irreconcilable ways. But there is some room for both of them prevailing, at least temporarily, because we started out with the economy at full employment, and monetary policy can drive the economy even higher. In other words, can reduce the so-called natural rate of unemployment down to pretty low levels. Bill Clinton got it down to about 3.8%, which means he was pushing the economy beyond its frontier, which you can do temporarily, but it comes back in your face. Or it comes back in Bush's face. So what we see is that consumers are trying to consume more, investors are trying to invest more, and that has the economy aiming for what I call a virtual equilibrium point that is beyond the frontier. Now, that's not going to work on a permanent basis, on a long-term basis. That's not genuine growth. That's a growth, or that's a spurt of output that's inconsistent with the underlying economic realities. And now I just show you this all at once so you can see it tells the same story both ways. Okay. Now let's bring in the production or the Hayekian triangle and show what's going on there. That you're getting two signals. The triangle is being stretched at both ends against the middle. The low interest rate, the heavy investment is stimulating research and development, extraction industries, early stage activities. And I show that by the triangle increasing in its early stages, but it can't be finished because the resources available, the resources just aren't available. Okay, there has been no genuine savings, so those projects can't be finished. All the more so because people are currently consuming more than they otherwise would have because the interest rate's so low, and that shows up too as stretching the triangle in the other direction to try to accommodate the immediate demands for consumer output. And so we get both overinvestment and malinvestment. There's the overinvestment moving along the frontier, the malinvestment, early stage production processes. Overconsumption compounds the problem. There's the overconsumption. We show that also in the Hayekian triangle. And this squares with a term that Mises used repeatedly. He says that boom is characterized by malinvestment and overconsumption. Okay, so you have the tug of war that pits consumers against investors, pushes the economy beyond its BPF The low rate of interest favors investment, and increasingly binding resource constraints keep the economy from reaching the extra PPF point. You can never get out there. Okay. You can see the orange arrow going out, and eventually it has that rightward tilt to it because investment is enormously encouraged. Eventually, it turns the other way back towards the frontier, and especially if policies are perverse, can go deep into depression. So now if you look at what we've got, a wedge, we've got tug of war, we've got dueling triangles. That's the term comes from John Cochran, which I like. And that's the language of disequilibrium. Okay, it's intertemporal disequilibrium. The interest rate is being held away from its market clearing level. And again, we'll show the diagrams and their interconnections. You can see all the phases of the business cycle. You can see the boom. You can see the bust, turns back towards the PPF. And you can see what Hayek called the secondary depression, that things go all haywire totally and the economy can spiral, especially with the perverse policies pursued by government, into deep depression. It's significant here that long arrow going into deep depression is the only aspect of any of this that Keynes saw. But he thought it was just caused by some spontaneous faltering of the investment community, a waning of animal spirits, he called it, that sent the economy into depression. Okay. Now, I usually don't line up words, the 3 Ps or the 4 Rs or whatever, but I couldn't resist here. Padding the supply with loanable funds with new money drives a wedge between saving and investment. Papering over the differences between saving and investment gives play to the tug of war between consumers and investors. And pitting early stage against late stage distorts the Hayekian triangle in both directions, the temporal discoordination eventually turning boom into bust. That's the analytics of the business cycle. And at this point, all we need to do is watch the whole thing play itself out. You pull the trigger and you watch the boom and bust. There you go, the business cycle. Okay, I think I'll quit at that point and give it a little bit of time for questions if we have some. Yes, sir.
The Japanese have a culture where they save an awful lot down to interest rates close to zero.
Mm-hmm.
Comment on that?
Well,
the inability to get out of their long stock.
Yeah, that's a worrisome way of putting it, actually, because it's the kind of critique that you get out of Bernanke or Greenspan, for instance, from the Federal Reserve, that, if only we had the interest rate higher, we could lower it. And if the interest rate's already down there close to zero, then you can't lower it. In fact, the way Greenspan said it is that there's no more, maybe there's no more arrows in our quiver. We've got to figure out other ways to stimulate the economy. But I think that the Japanese problem derives from the large extent to which it's the government and not the people that are dictating the rate of expansion. It really gets into more of a socialist calculation kind of a quandary rather than purely an interest rate problem. Several mainstream economists, or at least more mainstream than the ones you meet here, people like David Laidler or Axel Langenhofen, do say that the Japanese experience does resemble the Hayekian scenario of boom and bust. But whether you're talking about the Austrians or even the Keynesians, once it goes bust, then the demand for investment funds can decrease dramatically because people are just they're spooked. That's a good word. They don't know what's going on. But all the more so in Japan when there's the government to be spooked about. In other words, it's difficult for the business community to predict market conditions, but it's always difficult for them to predict what government's going to do next. even more so because government is the big player in that particular economy. So I would focus more on the big player aspect of government than on the purely macroeconomic aspects of it. Yeah.
The other thing I have is that one of the huge temporal changes that are taking place is the graying of our population. Much older populations that will be consuming decades into the future. And perhaps there's a real need for them to save for that future because instead of dying at age 60, they're going to be dying at age 95. And these things, or at least your computer program goes pretty fast. But maybe people's consumption things are more in decades. Maybe these things don't play out quite so fast.
Well, yeah, but look, on the screen, I want to make the changes dramatic enough that the people in the back of the room can see them, okay? I mean, you do the same thing when you teach micro. You know, you draw supply and demand, and then you say, suppose demand shifts out here. Well, in a way, that ends up overlooking a very important point, one that your question brings out, is that what's important in a market economy is that it be able to adjust even to small changes and certainly to cumulative changes over time. So these demographic factors, which are real factors that affect the saving rate, it's all the more important to allow market rates of interest to seek their own level as opposed to manipulating them with policy, if there are those kinds of changes going on. You see, the contrast to this is Keynes, who says saving depends on nothing but current income, period. Yeah, you've all written in the sophomore economic course, you write S equals minus A plus B, or, no, I don't want to get it wrong, times 1 minus B times Y. Okay, that's the saving equation. You all memorize that so you can play it back on the exam. But what's important about that equation is what's unstated. It should be, say, it should be S equals minus A plus 1 minus B times Y, period, which means the period means that it doesn't depend on anything else, like guess what, the interest rate. Okay, but Hayek is there to say savings does depend on the interest rate, and if saving changes, it needs to be allowed to have its effect on the interest rate, and that's something that even current policymakers don't allow for, because interest rates in this economy is something that the Federal Open Market Committee decides once every 8 weeks. Have we got time for one more question? Or what? Yeah, let me go ahead in the back.
What are the mechanisms? Padding, tapering, what are the mechanisms for
Well, the open market operations, in other words, creating more bank reserves so that banks will expand the money supply, and they expand it by making more loans, and they make more loans by charging a lower interest rate. So that's padding. Okay, and what else did I have there? Well, that's also the papering over. I mean, that's the paper money. In other words, why, when you cause the interest rate to be low, why doesn't that cause an immediate shortage of credit? Because the credit is available essentially from the Federal Reserve, who is creating the money and lending it out. Okay, and what pitting? Well, it's just that the incentives sent to savers will pay you a lower interest rate. You want to save more or less? Well, you'll save less. We'll give you a cheaper credit rate. You want to borrow more or borrow less? You'll borrow more. So you got some people trying to borrow more while others are saving less. So that pits one against the other. Okay? Okay, thank you very much.